In this week's written lecture, we've talked about the digital divide and distributive justice. In this video, I want to talk about the digital divide through another lens, that of human rights. Now, the digital divide refers to inequalities in access to information technology. Information technology allows us to do lots of things. We can pay our bills online, we can communicate with our friends via email, we can purchase services and products. More generally, access to information technology just opens up wider possibilities for action. But the main thing that information technology allows us to do is access information. And access to at least some amount of information is arguably a basic human right. We have basic human rights to those things, both goods and liberties, that are necessary for us to lead a minimally good life. So, for example, everyone has the human right not to be enslaved or tortured. And everyone has a right to shelter and adequate food and clothing. And, arguably, everyone has a right to access information. So, according to Article 19 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, everyone has the right to freedom of opinion and expression. This right includes freedom to hold opinions without interference and to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas through any media and regardless of frontiers. It might seem that things like food and shelter are clearly more basic than information. But it's not really clear that that's the case. Access to information is often a necessary means of getting those things. But by contrast, it's not really clear that access to information technology is a basic human right. Linking access to information technology and human rights is a really very recent phenomena. Human rights are concerned with assuring that individuals don't fall below certain minimally decent levels. And given how recently information technologies have come to play a central role in developed nations and the global economy, it's not really surprising that only a few countries and organizations have pressed for access to information technology to be recognized. After all, human beings have survived and even flourished for millennia without access to these technologies. So it seems it's a bit of a stretch to try to say that they're somehow essential to minimum human functioning. And yet, there is a small but growing movement to recognize the importance of access to information technology as a human right. So a couple years ago, the French Constitutional Congress declared access to the internet to be a human right, and Finland has followed suit in instituting a legal right to broadband access for every citizen. This kind of legislation and policy is responding to how essential information technology is becoming for individuals in developed nations. They need it to function and participate in their society. We need access to the internet to apply for jobs, to access government forms and documents, and other important yet routine activities. As information technology becomes more embedded in the daily life of a society, the burden of being unable to access those technologies increases. Sometimes the burden can be high enough that individuals' capacities to lead minimally good lives diminish when they lack access to technology. And if that's the case, then we may have strong rights to access technology derived from the value of information and our ability to exercise other rights, like our political rights and participation in culture. Human rights don't demand equality, but they can be an equalizing force. To see what I mean by this, imagine a society in which, say, 90% of the members possess some particularly useful new widget. They use this widget in all sorts of important ways. They use it to talk to each other, to access information, to buy goods, what have you. And because most of the people have widgets, other ways of accomplishing the tasks and functions that widgets perform either disappear or they become more difficult to access. That means that an individual who doesn't have the new widget finds that their freedom to choose how to live their life is greatly diminished, because many things that they could do or they could be now require the widget. In this case, human rights may demand that governments ensure significant access to the widgets for that 10% that lacks it because of the importance of widgets for the realization of many freedoms in society. If this seems like an unintuitive or unacceptable consequence of the view, consider this sort of second analogous example. So imagine that all public discourse takes place in an amphitheater. And the amphitheater is accessible through several doors, but those doors are preceded by large staircases, such that individuals with physical disabilities are unable to access the forum. Those individuals are thus prevented from any participation in public discourse. They're unable to receive or impart any opinions, ideas, or information. I think intuitively this is a case of a human rights violation. Freedom of expression is one of the most well-established human rights, and individuals with disabilities would be effectively denied the freedom to express themselves because in this particular society, freedom of expression requires access to the amphitheater. So the difference between the two cases is that widgets are new, and intuitively they seem somehow secondary, whereas access to the amphitheater seems somehow more basic. But it's not really clear, to me at least, why there should be a difference that human rights should be sensitive to. So consider access to medical care. Intuitively, access to medical care is deeply important, but even basic modern medical care has far more in common with the widget than it does to access to the amphitheater. And so there doesn't really seem to be a good reason, at least to me, to treat the two cases differently. If we can get access to the information that we have to have without using fancy information technology, then we don't necessarily have a human right to that technology. But given how important access to information technology is, the burden on those without access is becoming large. Large enough that there may be reasons to think that we do have a human right to access information technology in the context where certain kinds of information isn't available through other means. As many people have pointed out, citizens of first world countries need to be aware of how their actions, individually and collectively, affect the citizens of poorer countries. So, in particular, we need to be aware of how our actions affect whether people's basic human rights are satisfied around the world. Do citizens of poorer countries have less access to adequate food, clean water, and medicine as a result of choices made in the third world? So, Thomas Poga has argued, for example, that the incentive structure for the pharmaceutical industry, an amalgam of policies, market structure and intellectual property schemes, which make a lot of money for people in the first world, also ensure that drugs which could cure widespread debilitating diseases in the third world will either not be created or not be disseminated to the people that need them. These kinds of questions can be asked about access to information around the world too. So, for example, the international trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights, we'll just call it TRIPS, the TRIPS agreement seems to be harmful to developing nations. In fact, intellectual property was commonly pirated in the United States when it was a developing nation. And additionally, there's been resistance to global protections for traditional cultural expression. These are the sorts of things that we're going to talk about with respect to intellectual property. But the point is that we should probably be fighting for access to information in the same way that people fight for the provision of other basic human rights. There are many ways that access to information is essential to leading a minimally good life, and in many ways, it's an efficient way of improving lives. So, for example, in order to avoid poverty and corruption, citizens must be fully informed about the activities and decision-making of their government. In other words, there's a need for government transparency, and access to information helps to facilitate that. It also doesn't require expensive drugs to combat many of the serious diseases that plague poor countries. In many cases, significant health improvements can be achieved through the dissemination of basic health information. So, for example, people are much less likely to contract many diseases if they know simple techniques for filtering water and preparing food. Access to information is a critical part of general education, which can have huge benefits. So studies suggest that when women in third world countries get more education, it greatly reduces poverty levels. Reporting on a study done in Nicaragua, Pena and others claim that the educational level of the mother is closely linked to both her own and her household's socioeconomic conditions, as well as to other complex factors relating to her self-esteem, coping ability, and competence in mobilizing resources for herself and her offspring. This suggests that access to information and possibly access to information technology are important elements of human rights. And to me, that seems to suggest that there are important roles for librarians and other information professionals as human rights workers and advocates.